Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Could I please ask you to take a seat? So, let's get started. Before we do get officially underway for this year's GLOBSEC edition, I'd like to get you to all get your iPads out or your iPhones out with the app, just so we can go over it and familiarize ourselves with some of the different features that we can offer. So I'll give you just a quick moment to get your iPads out, get the app out. If you're not connected to the Wi-Fi, the local Wi-Fi here is called GLOBSEC 2015, and the password is GLOBSEC 2015, all in lowercase. Okay, so as you'll see on the screens behind me, you'll see that this is the main home screen. So on the home screen, you'll see the current session, the upcoming sessions, and you also see surveys as well when they'll appear. On the left-hand side, you will see the main menu, as you can see here. So we'll start on the, with the main menu. So for example, the agenda. Not everyone's listening, that's okay. So we have the agenda here. Can everyone see the agenda? Yes? So if you scroll down, you'll be able to see all the sessions taking place today. If you tap on the arrow on the top up right, you'll be able to scroll between day 1, day 2, and so forth. If you would like to see more information regarding that specific session, you just tap on the session itself, and then you will see the session description along with those speakers who will be presenting during that session. By tapping on the little man on the top left-hand corner, it will take you back to the main home screen, and then I'll take you down to speakers. By tapping on speakers, you'll be able to see the full list of presenters throughout the 3 days in Bratislava. Then you've also got participants. By tapping on participants, you'll be able to see all attendees. So by scrolling down, you'll be able to send messages amongst each other and so forth. Then, in the briefcase. So the briefcase is where you can share or where you can save your information. So if you save a session, this is where you will find it. If you exchange a business card, this is where you will find it. General logistics, so this will cover all general information that you will have, and then you should also have your own personal logistics page where you will be able to see your flight details, your hotel information, etc. So finally now, hopefully I'll get a little bit more attention from some of you, but we're going to go through some of the interactive features, which hopefully is a little bit more interesting for all of you. So first of all, you have on the top of the menu, you have a section called Post a Question. If you tap on Post a Question, you can actually ask a question to the presenter at any time throughout the session. So they will receive the questions, and they will hopefully, if it's a good question, be answered at some point. Then you close that. Now I would like to get some audience, I guess, interactivity. So we go to voting. So could I ask all of you, or as many of you as possible, to go to the voting section of the app. Hopefully everyone's on there. You can't get the app. You've got the 2014, okay, so after this session, come down to the registration desk and we'll help you out. So if you all have the voting screen here, I actually have a demonstration question, or I guess a fun question to get things started. So unfortunately, that is F11, please. Just a second. Okay, so just give them maybe a couple more minutes, and hopefully they will have something ready for us. I'll give you a hint as to what the question is about. So it's about the Football World Cup and 2022, which is a bit of a talking point, obviously, after the past couple of weeks. So hopefully we'll be able to see what the question is. Maybe not. Okay. Well, look, let's move on without the question. But initially, I'd like to say my question was, which country do you believe should host the 2022 FIFA World Cup? And I don't think any of you will say Qatar, but you never know. But anyway, so I'll leave that with you. Please stay seated. The GLOBSEC 2015 forum is about to start, so hopefully the next speakers will get some more attention. Thank you very much, and have a great forum. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats now. GLOBSEC 2015 is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Rastislav Kacher.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. They warned me they will be throwing flowers at 10 years. I see this is not happening. So business as usual, because 10 years, it's a great thing, but maybe nothing special. When we look in our lives, what we can do when we are 10, riding a bicycle, learning to swim, maybe some first love, whatever, nothing spectacular. But for events of this sort, 10 years, I think it's a little achievement. We should be proud. I don't mean we in the Slovak Atlantic Commission, but we, all of us who are here in the room, because this event could not happen without, of course, the great corporate support and partnerships we have, but without that splendid audience we've been having and splendid speakers for the last 10 years. And it's great privilege and pleasure to welcome so many presidents in the room, so many prime ministers at the conference, ministers, great minds, captains of the industry. That's a great privilege and great pleasure. For the last 10 years, been only 2, so I want to make special recognition to Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who's been partner for GLOBSEC since the beginning, and our corporate partner who is on the top, it's the BAE Systems. Those 2 deserve special credit, and we are very grateful for those 2 to be with us since the beginning. I still think there is a great need for conferences like this and for platform in Central Europe on which we can discuss a crucial security strategic affairs. And not only here in Central Europe, what is going on globally in Europe and NATO, but also from here to send our voice in our contribution, what kind of world we are walking into, and what is the way how we want to contribute and change this world. I looked into my previous opening speeches, and now I feel a little idiotic because I tend to say all the time all the same things, and it looks like a cliche. Security matters. There is a plenty of challenges. We should not be negligent. We should care. Nothing is granted. Sounds like cliché, but I will end up with one thing which caught my eye in the morning, because we tend to think EU, NATO, of course, it's been here forever. Why not will stay forever? It's been strong forever. Why not be strong forever? If the EU was such a sexy model of soft power, which is attracting millions of people to come here, it will be here forever. But it's not. It's not granted. We have to care. And there was in your packages, a GLOBSEC daily. And the quote which caught my eye, which I'd like to stress, was the Edward Lucas quote. Edward, a great little thing. The dreadful mess of 2015. We live in a dreadful mess. In reading out of cliché, quoting Edward Lucas, great friend and great mind, we really live in a complicated, challenging environment and in a dreadful mess. And I'm hoping and wishing you that here collectively we will be able to talk about it, where we are, where do we come from, but in particular, where do we want to get, how to get out of this dreadful mess, and how to make sure that the democracy, solidarity, freedom, and all the solidarity here in the region and within EU and NATO will continue to be our strength and not our weakness. Thank you all for coming. This is the warm welcome on behalf of the organizers, and now I have a special privilege and pleasure to pass floor on to the chairman of the GLOBSEC conference. Usually we do have two, because it's linked with Visegrad presidency, but now Deputy Prime Minister Lajčák is going to play a double role, the chairman, the presidency, and the Slovak foreign minister as well. Dear Mr. Minister, please, floor is yours, and get ready, because I'll be going around the stage to bring another guest, which is a very interesting one. All the best. Thank you very much, Minister, for coming and helping me.
Thank you, Rastio, and I will try to follow your advice. Dobrý deň a vitajte. Good afternoon. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Bratislava. Welcome to GLOBSEC. 1 year ago, I was standing right here, trying to get across at least some positive messages. I already suspected, like we all did, that it won't be an easy year. But sincerely, I did not expect it to be that hard. But it was, sometimes even harder than we could bear with dignity. Many issues on the international agenda have gone from bad to worse. Many tabled solutions, from promising to void. And most notably, they are all too close and too painful. It's not a nice picture that I'm drawing here, but it's a realistic one. And exactly this is something that we have to stick to under any circumstances. We need to have realistic plans, realistic expectations, realistic implementation, and a realistic feedback. If the last year's pileup of crises gave us something useful, it's the regained ability to shake off our own ignorance, self-illusion, and drowning into our own internal problems, which are minor to the major ones around us. However, I have the feeling that we still don't listen to, but rather past each other, which is maybe the most important item still waiting to be picked up from the lost and found of international politics in this complicated year. But to continue on a bit more positive note and take a look at ourselves in the first place. Last year, I was talking about the progress in stabilizing the Eurozone. And even from today's view, I still stand behind this position. The crisis punch that the European Union suffered put two crucial things in motion. First, the alarm call to mobilize efforts and come up with concrete measures was duly received. And second, at last, we started to think more strategically here and understood that the monetary footing without its fiscal counterpart will always walk with a visible limp, unless we stop ignoring this elementary logical imbalance. But what about Greece? One could argue. Candidly speaking, the willingness to help Greece at any price is minimal across Central and Eastern Europe, because we are talking about the part of Europe that voluntarily went through a long period of strict austerity and deeply painful reforms, to make it clear. Greece has to be exposed to strict measures, that's for sure. But on the other hand, it is understandable that the aim is to get the country back afoot and not to keep it on its knees. We are ready to consider various options, provided that the Greece will meet the conditions. A Grexit, seemingly logical to some, is not about the 1.5% share of the overall EU economy. If Athens defaulted on its debts, it would certainly send shockwaves throughout the whole of Europe. Yet, it takes two to tango. What about the UK, which is another pertinent issue when it comes to the European Union future? I'm sure that we will all learn much more on this from the UK's Prime Minister David Cameron himself shortly. But let me still make a few comments first. I don't think that most people on the Isles or in the continental Europe sincerely believe that the UK's potential departure from the European Union would do any good to London, including the city, or say to Edinburgh. Pragmatically speaking, I don't see much gain or benefit in exit, neither economically nor politically in the long run for both sides of the channel. Nonetheless, I do see positive side of the entire Brexit exercise. It made us all think again about the European Union's strategic heading, something we have long neglected and almost lost amidst the multi-speed Europe, something we owe to the founding fathers of European integration. It's a challenge, true, but it's also an opportunity to reflect on some elements of the European Union's foundations. There is always space for improvement, as the cliché aptly has it. We mustn't be afraid of any discussions and multitude of opinions, even on our very basics. I prefer a fervent debate concluded by a jointly owned compromise over playing the deaf and blind game and sending out opposing messages in the end of the day. An open and intense internal discussion is what makes us stronger and not weaker. We in Slovakia are ready for it. Ladies and gentlemen, last year, when I was talking about Ukraine, I talked about the new element of instability, right in our backyard. Well, now we know this instability, unfortunately, settled in, and it's not going to vanish unless we manage to deal with a couple of painful facts. First, we are not in a new Cold War, but the post-Cold War order, as we knew it, did suffer a major blow. Some even argue that it's already dead. Second, we do have a problem with Russia, but there is no problem solving without Russia either. Third, Russia is not prepared to give up on Crimea, and we don't really know how to deal with that. Fourth, we have no business as usual with Russia, but there are still many unfinished businesses to do on Iran, on North Korea, on all major disarmament regimes, nukes, terrorism, and then there is a Security Council and Russia in it, if nowhere else. On top of all that, we tend to ignore the fact that a huge part of the world doesn't care that much about what we in Europe see as a major geopolitical problem. Let's face it. And lastly, there will be no quick fixes. Resolving issues with Russia could take a long time. Sooner or later, we'll have to talk to Moscow, as shuffling around won't get us anywhere. What we badly need today is to fundamentally redefine our relations with Russia. At the same time, we need to think, better target, and make our support to Ukraine much stronger than it's the case today. This is what Slovakia, as a neighbor and friend of Ukraine, is trying to achieve. We started with a reverse gas flow, which helped Ukraine through the winter and saved its tight budget up to $3 billion. Gazprom decreased our supplies of gas by over 40% almost immediately. The reverse makes now for more than 70% of Ukraine's gas imports and covers almost 40% of the country's overall gas needs. Speaking of solidarity, stronger support is not about more money, or certainly not about more money only, and definitely not about more strong statements. It's about strategic assistance with reforms, about vision and coordination, which is lacking today, despite the indisputable efforts on the side of the Ukrainian central and local authorities. The external assistance should be orchestrated on the broadest possible level, engaging as many institutional partners and assistance frameworks with different niche capacities as possible, the European Union, the OSCE, and the OECD as well. And I'm glad to inform you that upon Slovakia's initiative, the OECD held a very useful and successful Day of Ukraine this Tuesday. The aim of the event is to boost Ukraine's interaction with the organization, make the best of its expertise, focus more on putting more concrete projects into practice in areas such as anti-corruption, public and corporate governance, tax administration, and the reform of the state-owned enterprises. It has a serious potential to bring some order into the Ukrainian institutional model, along with what many of us already do bilaterally. Another irreplaceable ingredient in helping Ukraine is the OSCE. It's mostly the only toolbox and the human rights first aid package we can apply on the spot. In order to succeed, we need to acknowledge that Ukraine today has the most pro-reform government ever, but there are still many players outside but also inside of the country which rather wish for a failure of the ongoing effort and reforms. And the danger of the collapse of state structures is everything but averted. Even the association agreement and DCFTA provides no 100% guarantee. According to the latest public opinion polls, only 31% of Ukrainians consider the country's stabilization efforts effective, and more than 50% are completely or almost completely discontented with how things in the country are progressing. And in the meanwhile, we need to better communicate that reforms, however painful, are for the good of the people of Ukraine, and also that their future depends mostly on them and no one else. After all, this is a lesson learned very well here in Central Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, what I was not talking about much last year was Europe's southern border. The Arab Spring that swept through the Middle East and North Africa removed several autocrats, but also turned the spring into a brutal winter, swiftly producing new threats. Proliferation of extremism, combined with influx of migrants, transnational crime, and economic instability, poses a direct danger to European security. There is no silver bullet solution for the crisis in North Africa, which is progressively getting even more severe, especially in Libya. Yet, a state of inaction could dangerously flash back on the streets of our capitals. Addressing these challenges will require both courage and prudence, both in economic and political terms, combined with security engagement with all stakeholders, state and non-state. Helping to build tailor-made state institutions, but also strengthening the existing ones, and in some cases the remaining ones, presents a long-run challenge without immediate quick wins. But it could bring preventive solution for decreasing instability, added roots, where is needed. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at a turning point for Euro-Atlantic security. The trouble that we face in the East and in the South made us engage in what we have long neglected: hard, energy, and cybersecurity, new threats, propaganda, and NATO's vulnerable eastern flank, and reminded us of the values that we firmly stand for. Transatlantic community faces rising challenges at multiple fronts. Long-term trends, be it changing demographics in our societies, rise of Asia, political awakening in the Arab world. This all meets with immediate security concerns along our periphery. Indeed, a ring of fire, as Carl Bildt pointed out. We are well aware where European allies must wade in, especially in area of reinvesting in NATO's capabilities. Boosting of defense budgets will not happen overnight, but since Wales and towards Warsaw, we must be all on the right track towards more fair burden sharing. Our potential is high. Our common toolbox is wide and still improving, but we must adapt to act more swiftly on complex issues, narrow our differences, but also to bring back our initiative in order to have the possibility to shape conflicts before they develop into crises. What personally concerns me is the lack of strategic thinking that we have been going through lately, and also the related failure of prevention, as the report of the OSCE's panel of eminent persons points out aptly. There are questions vital to our future to which we need to have answers, like how do we see our relations with Russia in 10 or 15 years from now? How flexible are we going to be on sanctions once there is a progress? Why do we accept that the two closest ever integration frameworks, NATO and the European Union, have so little institutional synergy? What will be the outcome of our lately shy open door policy, both in the European Union and NATO? How can we aid building European societies in countries to which we deny European perspective? And how do we adapt our neighborhood policy in order to raise our once natural political gravity? The missing answers clearly prove that we have neglected our basic political homework. We have existing organizational instruments that the other geopolitical regions can only dream of. Besides the United Nations, we have the European Union, we have NATO, we have OECD, we have Council of Europe, and also the overarching OSCE. So why not to use them to their fullest? It's the venues and fora like this where we could and should catch up, where our patterns of thinking are exposed to useful outside perception and genuinely global scrutiny. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the way forward? We should build our future actions on hard facts and hard facts only. We have enough resources and tools of verification. Let us use them in a timely manner. We should avoid taking what we consider appropriate in theory to be appropriate in general. It often proves far from ideal on the ground and causes much havoc. Excluding or sidelining someone of little liking is often tempting, but may also unwantedly compromise the only feasible solution on the ground. What appears as a window of opportunity for a positive regime change towards more democracy may become a breeding ground for extremists. We should therefore pay more attention to the often neglected socio-economic factors. And when more than one of these mistakes occur together, as they often do, combined with underestimating of local unsensitivities, we usually end up with entirely new threats emerging on multiple front lines, such as Boko Haram, Islamic States, or the migration issue in the Mediterranean. A chain of specific bad decisions almost always results in complex problems. Furthermore, it's easy to choose quick-fix solutions and populist gestures over politically harder but more sustainable politics in the long run. The outcome is usually extreme, aggressive, and irrational. That's why we face a growing number of hatred-based and non-systemic parties all over Europe. Sometimes we miss an opportunity by ignoring what's obviously needed. We tend to over-concentrate on bureaucratic and technical aspects and may lose much more in the end. And to be clear, I'm speaking now about Montenegro's invitation to join NATO. Sometimes it takes us too long to agree on procedural issues when a crisis surfaces, and the chances that the job will be taken by someone else in the meantime shoot up, not speaking about the lost momentum to become a part of the solution. We overestimate the scope of we consider our like-minded world. We often formulate our statements as if the we was standing for almost the entire world, yet it isn't. Many bigger or smaller players beyond the West, across Asia or Latin America, share very little of our concerns. We can't take their support for our actions for granted. We should invest time and energy to make sure that they understand our purpose and support our actions. And on top of that, we should pay much more attention to local specifics. They truly matter. We should all start genuinely listening to each other, not only between opposed sides, but also among us. Everybody has a niche capacity, no matter how big or small the country is. And finally, as I already said, let us remind ourselves of the importance of international institutions. Many of them are currently suffering from a lack of balance. And sometimes it's their own member states that contribute to their erosion. As a result, we have seen push for reforms in our multilateral architecture. I say openly, I'm not a big fan of creating new, alternative, or ad hoc structures unless absolutely necessary. Instead, I believe that we should stick to what we have already created, what we have already created. A fine-tuning might be necessary and useful, but we need to give a chance to existing structures. We are nowhere near the rim of their possibilities and exploitation. Ladies and gentlemen, looking at the audience, looking at you, I feel pleased and honored to have so many political and experts, heavyweights, with us here in Bratislava today. Bratislava being already a firm place on the map of transatlantic thinking. GLOBSEC and Slovakia are symbolically connected in their success stories. The forum is a unique NGO to government project that evolved from its initial student stage into one of the most important security and foreign policy gatherings on a global scale. This is a jubilee year for GLOBSEC. It's round edition number 10. My sincere thanks go to the organizers for putting together such a great event, for not resting on laurels and making it better every year, and for attracting such distinguished and impressive lineup of guests. Being a pragmatic optimist and a GLOBSEC enthusiast, my final message and reminders go back to what I feel obliged to emphasize lately. Speaking as a diplomat, let us prefer even the hardest compromise over aggression. Let us focus more on prevention to be less occupied with crisis management. Let us really listen to each other, no matter whether we agree or not. And finally, let us rediscover the urgent necessity of strategic security thinking. Thank you, and once again, welcome to Bratislava and enjoy the GLOBSEC.
Let me thank on my and our behalf the Deputy Prime Minister Lajčák. And I made many introductions during those years in GLOBSEC, but there are some which are always special. And this one is special to me because I'm one of those Slovaks who are biased, because these more than 20 years ago when I came for the first time down there, I thought, what can be special about this disgusting ale, playing darts in the pub and eating a haggis sandwich for the morning. But once it becomes the acquired taste, you cannot get rid of that simply. And you think it's splendid to have among us in Europe a country in which you can dress a black morning coat, put on a top hat, and you don't like a fool. And I mean, the Britain was able to combine the sense of tradition and also, on the other hand, an absolute modernity, I think, is one of the best within the EU. On the original program, there was written a keynote speech by the senior cabinet member of the UK government. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's a special privilege and pleasure to welcome someone who could not be more senior than the Right Honourable David Cameron, the Prime Minister and the leader of the Conservative Party himself. Mr. Prime Minister, warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you for that introduction. And we meet at a time when Europe faces extraordinary challenges. There's the threat of ISIL-inspired terrorism, luring our young people to fight in the Middle East and casting a shadow of terrorism over us at home. There's the Russian-backed aggression in Ukraine attempting to redraw Europe's borders and sowing fear amongst those people and nations that dwell on Russia's periphery. There's the combination of failed states and criminal gangs in North Africa, driving desperate migrants across the Mediterranean in the hope of reaching our shores. And that is to say nothing of the risks of cyber attacks, of climate change, and of global pandemics that threaten us all. And let me start by saying this. Britain is committed to Europe's security. I speak as Prime Minister of a country whose military aircraft are flying patrols over the Baltic, whose troops are training Ukrainian soldiers, whose Royal Air Force is delivering the second highest number of airstrikes over the terrorist-held territory of Iraq, whose soldiers, medics, and aid workers are combating Ebola in Sierra Leone and preventing its spread, and whose Royal Navy amphibious assault ship, HMS Bulwark, has pulled nearly 3,000 migrants from sinking dinghies that have set off from Libya. Our soldiers, our airmen, our sailors are out there every day doing their job, and they are part of a long tradition. Britain has never stood by when Europe's security is in peril. This year we mark the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Europe from Nazism, in which my country played a leading part. Last year we marked a quarter of a century since the Iron Curtain was torn down and freedom rolled across our continent. In the decades of division which followed 1945, Britain always stood firm in defense of liberty, and we do so now. The challenges we face today are large and they are many, but I remain confident we will meet them. I believe we've succeeded in the past when we've stood by the values that have made European nations strong and successful. Democracy, freedom of speech, free enterprise, equality of opportunity, human rights. These are the things that unite us, and history shows that we succeed when we stand up for them and when we do so together. Tyranny, fascism, hatred, they have always come off worse when confronted by our determination to defend our values and our way of life. But we should recognize the dangers today from the people who say that this time things are different. This time, in the case of Russia, they say that what's required is understanding rather than condemnation. So we should engage with them instead of imposing sanctions. In the case of terrorism, they say that the rise of ISIL shows the danger of getting involved, so we should turn our backs on the Middle East. In the case of migrants being tricked and trafficked, they say this is something that should be managed rather than solved, so we should carry on allowing them to attempt this perilous crossing. I think these arguments are profoundly wrong, and I'm very clear about the principles that need to be applied. First, we need to be clear about the primacy of economic strength and success. Without prosperity, there is no security. It is simple. If our economies in Europe are not strong, then there won't be the money to spend on defense, or on addressing the problems in failed states around the world, or on providing our law enforcement with the tools that they need to keep our people safe. With the second largest defense budget in NATO and the largest in the European Union, Britain is investing heavily in modernizing the defense of our own nation and our forces available to the Atlantic Alliance. Over the next 10 years, we are spending over 220 billion euros on the latest military equipment, the largest 2 aircraft carriers our Navy has ever seen, new hunter-killer submarines, state-of-the-art air defense destroyers, and new frigates. Forces to protect our own country, forces to make sure we can honor our commitments to our allies. And let us be clear, this is only possible because we have a strong and stable economy. We're only able to buy this equipment and upgrade our capabilities because we've taken the difficult decisions on our public finances and stuck to a long-term economic plan. But economic stability doesn't mean we should rest on our laurels. We must go further. For a start, in Europe, we must drive forward the completion of the single market, and we must open that market up to trade around the world. Britain is a trading nation. We want to reach out to other countries and make connections across other continents. Trade is perhaps the oldest form of cooperation known to man. Open markets, it is rightly said, open minds. We believe that building bridges through trade provides prosperity for working people at home and security abroad. That's why we want to go further and open up European nations to free trade around the world. That means more trade with India, with Latin America. It means working towards an EU-China free trade agreement. And it means, above all, moving rapidly to agree a free trade agreement with America that sees trade flowing even more freely across the Atlantic. Now, the second part of the approach we need is clarity. In ISIL, we have one of the biggest threats our world has faced. We need to be clear about the nature of that threat. The scale is formidable and growing. It stretches right across our continent, with young people leaving Belgium, Sweden, Austria, France, and Britain for the Middle East. The nature of the threat is grave. There are young people, boys and girls, leaving often loving, well-to-do homes, good schools, bright prospects, traveling thousands of miles from home to strap explosives to their chests and blow themselves up and kill innocent people. To live in a place where marriage is legal at the age of 9 and where a woman's role is to serve the jihadists. To be part of a so-called state whose fanatics are plotting and encouraging acts of despicable terrorism in the countries from which they have come. It's what we've seen this week with the youngest suicide bomber in our history in Iraq. It's what we may have seen with 3 women and their young children who went to Saudi Arabia to perform their pilgrimage and who are thought to have gone to ISIL territory. Only if we are clear about this threat and its causes can we tackle it. The cause is ideological. It is Islamist extremist ideology, one that says that the West is bad, that democracy is wrong, that women are inferior, that homosexuality is evil. It says religious doctrine trumps the rule of law, and caliphate trumps nation state. And it justifies violence in asserting itself and achieving its aims. The question is, how do people arrive at this worldview? How does someone who's had all the advantages of a British or European schooling, a loving family, the freedom and equality that allow them to be who they want to be, turn into a tyrannical, murderous, evil regime? There are, of course, many reasons, and to tackle them we have to be clear about them. I'm clear that one of the reasons is that there are people who hold some of these views who don't go as far as advocating violence, but who do buy into some of these prejudices, giving the extreme Islamist narrative weight and telling fellow Muslims, you are part of this. This paves the way for young people to turn simmering prejudice into murderous intent, to go from listening to firebrand preachers online to boarding a plane to Istanbul and traveling onward to join the jihadis. We've always had angry young men and women buying into supposedly revolutionary causes. This one is evil. It is contradictory. It is futile, but it is particularly potent today. And I think part of the reason it's so potent is that it has been given this credence. So if you're a troubled boy who's angry at the world, or a girl looking for an identity, for something to believe in, and there's something that's quietly condoned online, or perhaps even in parts of your local community, then it's less of a leap to go from a British teenager to an ISIL fighter or an ISIL wife than it would be for someone who hasn't been exposed to these things. That is one of the factors. There are others, not least questions of national identity and making sure young people in our country feel truly part of it. And we need to deal with all of these things. But if we are to really tackle this threat, we need to confront extremism in all its forms, violent and non-violent, to stop our young people sliding from one to the other. We also need to be clear about the ideology's methods. It may be medieval in its outlook, but it is modern in its tactics, with the internet as the main tool to spread its warped worldview. Being clear about these things will allow us to develop the powers we need to root out this poison. And being clear where responsibility does and doesn't lie is also key. Too often we hear the argument that radicalization is the fault of someone else. That blame game is wrong, and it's dangerous. By accepting the finger pointing, whether it's at agencies or authorities, we're ignoring the fact that radicalization starts with the individual, and we'd be in danger of overlooking many of the ways we must try and stop it at source. We need to treat the causes, not just the symptoms. Now, of course, we'll do everything we can to help the police and intelligence agencies to stop people traveling to Syria. But we mustn't miss the point. They are not responsible for the fact that people have decided they want to go. In Britain, we're strengthening the ability of the police and security services to disrupt terrorist plots, giving them all the tools they need. And we're working with the internet industry to tackle terrorist propaganda, removing over 90,000 pieces of material since 2010. We're also working with other EU member states to set up an EU internet referral unit based on the British model that will be up and running from next month. And we're doing these things because we acknowledge just how widespread, how complex, and how dangerous this threat is. Now, third, we must be uncompromising about attempts to redraw Europe's borders by force. We are clear. Crimea and the Donbass are part of the territory of Ukraine. They were recognized as such by Russia and by the rest of the international community. What Russia has done and continues to do is in breach of its own obligations under international law. Our first task is to make diplomacy succeed. We must be uncompromising in insisting that the Minsk agreements are fully honored by all. We must also be uncompromising in our support for Ukraine. President Poroshenko's government deserves support to deliver vital political and economic reforms, and we must provide that support. Britain is doing so through our Good Governance Fund, and we're looking at what more we can do. And we should be clear, the Ukrainians are victims, not aggressors. And fourth, we must be optimistic and ambitious. This is particularly the case when it comes to our ability to address failed states. We are currently seeing unprecedented migration from troubled states in Africa and the Middle East on Europe's southern flank. It is a tide of humanity desperately seeking a better life. We must, of course, do what we can to help those in danger of losing their lives at sea, and we are. Britain will always meet its obligations to provide refuge for the most vulnerable. We already participate in the UN's program to resettle refugees who fled from their home countries, including those affected by conflict and civil war. And we also set up our own scheme for vulnerable people fleeing the conflict in Syria, including women and children at risk who couldn't be protected in the region. And today I can announce that we'll work with the United Nations to modestly expand this national scheme so that we provide resettlement to the most vulnerable fleeing Syria, those who cannot be adequately protected in neighboring countries. But we won't resolve this crisis unless we do more to stop these people leaving their countries in the first place, until we break the link between boarding a boat and settling in Europe. This is where we need to work together as European nations to tackle the root of the problem, not merely to alleviate its symptoms. Again, clear thinking is needed. All the evidence shows that the most important factor in someone's decision to make this journey is how they'll be treated in terms of being allowed to stay in Europe. So schemes of relocation don't solve this problem. What works is what the Spanish did when migrants arrived in their thousands in the Canary Islands. They worked with the countries people were coming from and traveling through. They made sure they had the right police, coast guard, aid and governance resources to stop people taking the decision to leave. And they made sure that the economic migrants who did end up leaving were returned safely. We need to do the same on a larger scale. We should be leading the world on promoting development and helping our international partners build stronger institutions. Now, despite difficult economic times, Britain has kept its commitment to spend 0.7% of our GDP on overseas aid. It is the right thing to do to build prosperity for the world's poorest, and it's the right thing to do to help stabilize and secure countries in the long run, protecting our security here in Europe. So from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, these security threats they often have one thing in common: a failure of governance in other countries. It is the failure of governance in African states that leads many to want to leave. It is in part the failure of Libyan governance, which has allowed the traffickers to profit from human misery. It was the failure of Ukrainian governance in the years before 2014, which led to discontent and instability. It's the failure of governance in the Middle East, which has left a vacuum within which ISIL can proliferate. The fear of the family in eastern Ukraine, listening to the Russian shells get closer and closer to their home, and the desperation of the family in Eritrea, willing to risk everything in order to reach the edge of Europe. All this human tragedy comes back to a failure of governance in these countries. So let us now show that we can deal with this. Let us show that we understand the primacy of economic security and political stability, that we are clear about these threats, we are uncompromising in our response, and we are confident of our ability to address failed states. Because if we do all those things, and I have no doubt that we can, we will be able to deal with these threats, and we will successfully protect the security of all our nations. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. We've got thank you very much. Got time for some questions. I think there's someone with a microphone. If you put your hand in the air and say who you are and where you're from, I'll do my best to answer. Lady at the back.
Hello, my name is Isabel Kumar. I'm from Euronews. And I have two questions for you. You mentioned spending on NATO. So what about the 2% budget that would be necessary to continue with your spending on NATO? And then secondly, you evoked the idea of economic stability. How would a British exit from the European Union affect Britain's economic stability and therefore its ability to provide the defence that's required?
Okay, well, first of all, on NATO and spending, Britain is a country that has continually met its 2% spending commitment. We met it last year, we're meeting it this year. We have a spending review that we're conducting now, and we'll announce the conclusions of that in the autumn. And I think when you look around Europe, the tragedy is so few countries actually come anywhere close to meeting 2%. It's good that countries, including many in this part of Europe, are now increasing their spending to get closer to the 2%. But the 2% is an obligation on all. And particularly in Wales at the NATO summit, we made a particular point about the emphasis on those who are way lower than 2% making up the spending. What I set out in my speech today is important as well, because as well as the level of spending, what actually matters is what you're spending the money on. And the most important thing of all is that you have deployable equipment, usable equipment, modern equipment. It's no good having a large standing army if it doesn't actually have the equipment to be able to deploy it rapidly to trouble spots and to protect your vital interests in the world. So that investment of £160 billion over 220 billion euros over the next 10 years is particularly vital. As for Britain's place in Europe, my aim is to secure Britain's place in a reformed European Union. I'm a great believer that if you have a problem, if you have difficulties, which Britain has had with the European Union, then the best thing to do is to have a strategy and a plan for overcoming them. I think people have looked at the European Union in recent years and have seen, instead of it being a source of growth and jobs and innovation, there's been too much economic stagnation. So let's fix that, and that's very much part of my plan. People in Britain have seen that sometimes the European Union seems to want to get involved in issues that are for nation states. So let's try and fix that, have a plan, and then hold that referendum. And I'm confident that my strategy, that my plan will deliver this outcome of Britain in a reformed European Union. And I make this point here because I think this reform will actually be of benefit to the whole of Europe. We all need Europe to tie up to the fast-growing economies of the world and to sign these trade deals. We all need Europe to invest in completing a single market in digital and services in energy so that we're a source of growth and investment and jobs rather than a source of stagnation. So yes, this program is important for Britain and our membership of this organization, but I think it will bring real benefits for others as well. Gentleman here in the middle.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. I'm Ayman Mhanna from Lebanon. You mentioned something very important about the new plan for resettling vulnerable Syrian refugees out of neighboring countries. Can you provide us some more details about this? And specifically looking on the larger picture in Syria, not only on the ISIL aspect, but the broader conflict in Syria, what is your position and any kind of announcement that you can make today? Thank you.
Okay. First of all, on what Britain and other countries can do to resettle vulnerable families, this is only ever going to be a very small part of what needs to be done. What we have done in the past is measured in the hundreds of families that are particularly vulnerable, that can't be looked after in the region. As I'm saying today, we think that that can be modestly expanded. But let's be frank about it. The situation with millions of refugees and displaced people inside Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and elsewhere, this needs a massive humanitarian aid effort of money going into the region. And Britain is the second largest bilateral aid donor to make sure those people can have the shelter and the food and the protection that they need. But the long-term answer cannot be for people to live in camps year after year. It's got to be to go back to the countries they came from, which leads to your second question, which is what is the route to a more secure Middle East, particularly in Syria and Iraq? Well, we could spend all day on that, but I would just say, in a sentence, both countries need the same thing, which is a government that can represent all of their people. It is this failure of governance that I talk about that it's the heart of the problem. Why did ISIL take hold in Syria and then Iraq? Well, because Bashar Assad was one of the greatest drivers to ISIL because of the butchery of his own people. Why did ISIL succeed in taking hold in Iraq? Because Maliki was not a prime minister for all of the Iraqi people, Sunni, Shia, and Kurd. So while it will be a very complicated and difficult path to have a new Iraq and a new Syria, the end goal is simple. You need a government that can represent all of the people. Then you're more likely to have the peace and stability required and people can return. Until then, Britain will continue to fulfill its humanitarian and moral obligations by being one of the biggest aid donors to the region and making sure people are given a place of safety. Sir.
Hello, my name's Edward Lucas. It was great hearing you talk so toughly about Putin's attack on Ukraine. I'm sure there are many people in the room who are very glad to hear that. But Britain's stance towards Mr. Putin would be much more effective if rich Russians weren't finding Britain such a wonderfully convenient place to buy property.
And football teams. Yeah.
Football teams. The City of London has the reputation in Russia as being the place you need to go if you want to launder a really large amount of money. Smaller amounts, go to Riga or Cyprus or somewhere like that. It's a really big amount. Go to London because the banks and the lawyers and the accountants there have a really good expertise in listing dodgy companies and putting large amounts of money.
Well, let me take the two bits of your questions. First of all, London as a financial centre. I would argue that we actually have some of the toughest rules on money laundering, on tax evasion, anywhere in the world. In fact, we are the first country in the world, and the head of the OECD is nodding at me as I say this. He's sitting two down from you. Angel, very good to see you. Congratulations on your re-election. We are the only... He's on his third term. I'm only on my second. But the point is, we are the only country in the world that has pledged to introduce and is on the way to introducing a register of beneficial ownership so you can see who owns every company. I put that on the agenda at the G8 in Northern Ireland. Britain has taken the first step. Every other G8 country has signed up to having an action plan to put in place similar arrangements. So I don't accept for a moment that London is somehow backward when it comes to being a proper policeman on these issues. I would also argue, and I would hope that my fellow prime ministers and presidents from Central and Eastern Europe will back me up on this, when it comes to arguing for sanctions against Russia because of the action taken in Ukraine, Britain has been in the lead. We have been the ones arguing time and time again we have to take a tough and united response, and we played an important role in keeping the EU and the United States together. Now, in the end, there is no military solution to this conflict, so the best thing that Europe and America can do is a very strong response to Putin and to Russia to say that unless you fulfill the Minsk agreements, those sanctions will not be relieved. And in fact, if you go further, if you encourage another grab of territory in Ukraine, more sanctions will be put in place. So I think Britain has played a very strong role, in spite of the fact that this might lead to reduced trade flows or investment flows in terms of Russia. We know that there is a much more important long-term consideration, and I would make this point to anyone in the European Council who thinks perhaps now is the time to take the foot off the gas. Of course, there might be some short-term relief in terms of relieving sanctions, but the longer-term loss to Europe of saying it is okay to redraw boundaries by force, that it's okay to give up the rules of the international road, that would be disastrous for Europe, and that's why the argument for tough sanctions against Russia has won the day, and I believe will continue to win the day in the European Council next week. Gentleman back here.
Good afternoon. Mario Nicolini. I'm the General Rapporteur for this conference. Prime Minister, when a small but significant part of this GLOBSEC community met last December at Chateau Bella, there was considerable frustration that you were focusing too much on your home audience with the Europe agenda. Do you now have the confidence that you are bringing a convincing agenda on Europe to this region, which is a natural ally on many agenda items on Europe, and what response are you getting from your counterparts?
Well, first of all, I would say that having an agenda of wanting to reform and renegotiate Britain's place in Europe doesn't exclude you from making important breakthroughs on other foreign policy priorities. As I said at the beginning of my speech, Britain is seriously engaged in a number of activities, whether it's flying air policing missions over the Baltic. We're the second largest participants in the coalition against ISIL in Iraq. We took on the responsibility, really, for the whole of Sierra Leone and dealing with the Ebola crisis, just as America took on the whole of Liberia in terms of what they were dealing with the crisis. So I don't accept that you can either have a European strategy or a global strategy. A country like Britain, that is members of the G8, the G20, the EU, NATO, the Commonwealth, we should be using all the networks and all the links we have to make sure that Britain is a successful trading and investing nation right around the world. In terms of how my EU reform agenda is going, look, it's going to be hard work to convince everybody that change is necessary, but I'm absolutely convinced that it's right. I think it's right for Europe. We need more competitiveness. We need fair rules between those that are in the euro and those that are out of the euro. We need to crack this problem of large migratory movements around Europe, far bigger than what the Founding Fathers ever envisaged, and I think the right way to do that is greater determination of national welfare systems. And also, I would argue, we should deal with those issues that Britain feels particularly strongly about in terms of our European membership, that we've always believed that this is about joining an association of states that cooperate and work with each other, rather than believing that the final destination is some federal state or European state. Britain has never believed in that. We don't believe in that. That is not the reason for our membership, and I want that made explicit, which is why I make such attention to these words, ever closer union. This is not what Britain seeks. When it comes to our membership, we're the first to argue for completing the single market. We're the first to argue for sanctions against Russia or Iran. We're the first to say that the structural funds that have helped economies in Eastern and Central Europe to be so successful, these are great things. But we never joined the European Union for an ever-integrating Europe. That's not our path. It may be the path of some others, the Eurozone countries. I believe they need to integrate more in order to avoid the Greece of the future. That's my view. I don't want to stop them from doing that. But in a nutshell, it comes down to this. Is the European Union a flexible enough organization so that it can include and work for Eurozone members and non-Eurozone members? That is the question. I believe the answer will be yes, but with my fellow heads of government and state, we've got to prove that point, because that, I think, is the question that the British people will rightly be asking. Time for one more? Gentleman over here.
Thank you, sir. Vladan Simonovic from Center for Democracy and Human Rights from Podgorica, Montenegro. Prime Minister, what would be your position of your government for inviting Montenegro to become next member of NATO up to the end of this year?
I think there's a very strong case for Montenegro to be the next member of NATO. We supported that at the successful NATO conference we hosted in Cardiff in Wales, and I believe it'll be a very big feature of the upcoming NATO discussions. I think the only point we would make is that NATO membership's a very important move for a country, a very important set of obligations, and it needs to have the strongest possible domestic support. That when a country takes this step, the greater the political consensus and public consensus behind membership, the better. If I think of my country, we have parties of the left, parties of the right, parties that want to pull out of Europe, parties that are... Everyone agrees that NATO membership is a vital part of Britain's national interest, that we're a leading player in this organization, as I said, the biggest defense budget for NATO in Europe. The greater consensus you can have about these things, the greater role your country will be able to play in NATO and the greater support other members will be able to give you. Can I thank you again for a very warm welcome? I think it's been a really good discussion. And I wish you well for the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Mr. Prime Minister,
thank you.
Let me thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be a half an hour break. Be back in 2 o'clock. Refreshments is served in the lobby.